Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen, whatever time you're tuning in the program here at allpointstv.com. We are here live from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock every Monday, and we are picking up today the program for Comcast. We will be coming on there as a new addition to the program and coming on at Comcast at another time period. And we're very glad to have them aboard. We'll be doing the first 27 minutes of the program today for Comcast, and then we'll take a pause and then continue the program for the viewers here that we have at allpointstv.com. I'm George Moss, and we're the host of the program here called What's Going On, and our program airs every Monday, and you can catch us live at your convenience at the appropriate time that you want to tune us in. And we tape this program. We're available online, and you can, that's why I say at the beginning of the program, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time at your leisure. As I was coming to the studio today, I was listening to the pundits on radio talking about the upcoming election in Wisconsin, and that means we are taping the program prior to the 5th. We're taping this program on April the 4th. And the election there is one of the most critical and crucial elections we've had so far in the delegation process in the Republican Party. And I really think this election is the one that's going to either make the camel or break the camel's back in the political arena, because if this election is won by Donald Trump, I think that it is a done deal. So they're bringing out all the horses here on both sides. I think that the ones who are trying to stop Donald Trump in terms of his march toward the 1,237 votes that are needed that are now stated to be needed. It might in fact change. But as it stands right now, the number of votes they're saying that's needed to go into the Republican National Convention in July, they're saying that the number of votes that are needed there in order to bring the nominees over the top will be a majority of the 2,472 delegates that are supposedly out there in the balloting process, of which one half plus one of those delegates will be 1,237 delegates. Now, I have to tell you something. That's subject to change. That's subject to change if Donald Trump gets the number that they now claim would be the majority of those votes plus one. You know, the majority is half plus one, and I would not put it past the Republican Party power brokers to change that if in fact that standard is in fact met. And Wisconsin, the vote which will be held on the 5th, April the 5th, is kind of like critical toward marching down that road. Everything looks very good for Donald Trump after Wisconsin, because the votes are going to be going out in some areas, going on the East Coast and also the West Coast. He's looking good in New York, looking good in Pennsylvania, looking good as it goes to the West Coast in California. I think he'll do well in those states. But it's critical that he will in fact be in the hunt for the 42 delegates that's coming up in the election tomorrow in Wisconsin, the Badger State. And that's why the Republican Party is pulling out all stops in terms of trying to get the people out there in that arena to stop this train wreck as they see it, because if Donald Trump becomes a nominee, they're not so much fearful of Donald Trump losing the election in general. They are more fearful of him winning than they are in fact losing it. In fact, they're saying that if he does get the nomination, a lot of them are talking about bolting the party and going over in the Democratic Party and voting for Hillary Clinton if she's a nominee over there. And that's not even a done deal, given the fact that there might be some things that go around make a circuitous route around her nomination, and maybe she won't even get the nomination over there, given some of the legal matters that she's entangled with. We might be seeing what is being predicted by the University in Illinois, that has pretty much said that they've been right on all the elections since 1976, and they're saying that their prediction is that Bernie Sanders will be the president of the United States. That's a stretch in my view, but that's one of the this University in Illinois has predicted that, and they've been right on all the elections going back to 1976. when they made the prediction there that it would be, which was really quite interesting, Jimmy Carter, who was an outsider at that time. So we'll see how it shakes out. But I can tell you right now that they're doing everything they can to stop Donald Trump from getting the nomination here in the Republican Party for the year 2016. And those persons in the state right now, I'm talking about the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, is in the state. We know that Paul Ryan, who was the Speaker of the House and was a Republican Party vice presidential nominee in 2012, he's there. Scott Walker, who ran for president, was knocked out of the box, one of the first ones to bow out. I think it was number 2 to bow out after Perry canceled his presidential aspirations. I think that Scott Walker was number 2, if I recall correctly, of the 14 persons that have dropped out of the race for the presidency in the Republican Party. There were 17 to start out with, and is now down to 3. And Donald Trump leading by some 200 plus delegates at this point, and that does not fit well with the power brokers in the Republican Party, and they're trying to stop this train. And it's a train wreck for them on both sides of the divide. It's a train wreck if he loses, because other persons that are depending upon the coattails of the standard bearer of the Republican Party would also lose, but they lose also if he wins, because if he wins as an outsider, then what does that make the insiders? It turns them into outsiders if the campaign is successful. And that is more of a fear for Donald Trump in terms of Donald Trump's campaign than if he were losing in his bid to become president, because they still maintain their power in the Republican Party. And that's something that's been kind of interesting in how this is shaken out in the election in 2016. We've learned a lot in terms of this outside candidacy. And what I've learned more than anything else is how the two parties basically, the twain does meet at some point where the two parties share the same interests. And that might be why nothing changes, regardless as to whose party wins. It's really interesting to look at this from the standpoint of what we learned during the 2016 election season, because I can see now why the Democrats get in the presidency and it works a certain way with them being in power, and the Republicans get in there and nothing changes all that fundamentally in terms of how they in fact exercise power. And it's now a little bit more clear why that goes on. And one of the reasons is that both parties pretty much are in alliance with each other as far as being the parties of the status quo. And one writer, as a matter of fact, said that the election process is really one party. He calls it the incumbent party. And it's like, one party scratches the other party's back, and when the other party gets in there, they're doing likewise, and nothing really fundamentally changes regardless of which party is in power. And I could not understand why there was such a reticence in terms of how the status quo is maintained regardless of which party is in power until this election season came up. And I'm getting to look at this thing a lot more, ask us now the question of why doesn't it change? And it's clear that it doesn't change because they're basically both parties that maintain that which is already in place. And really, let's understand that neither party is a revolutionary party in the sense that we are going to have an upheaval, regardless as to who is in fact the office holder, standard bearer in the political process. Both parties pretty much maintaining the same political paradigm. And that has been really quite clear, I think, based upon what we've seen here in the last several elections. Obama came in 2008. He was talking about change you could believe in, but never did quantify what change he was talking about. I knew the change I believed in, and I think most voters were pretty much aware of what they thought that this change was he was talking about. But it was never really defined what was actually being said. It left us so generic in general that you really couldn't put a handle on, okay, what specific changes are we talking about? Because that was left, undefined. And certainly there was no elaboration on it, because if you don't define it, you can't elaborate on it. You can't elaborate on something that is non-specific as it was in 2008. And what I'm finding out going into the 8th year of Obama's presidency is that none of the change that I was thinking about was what I've seen over the last 7 years going toward the 8th year and final year of this presidency. Now we have another person that's even more of an outsider than Obama was, because Obama was not so much an outsider. He had been 2 years he had been elected to the Senate in 2006. So 2007 and then 2008, when he's now running for the presidency, he had only been there for about the same amount of time that Ted Cruz had been in there. And now we have quote unquote lying Ted, lying Ted, running for the presidency. But really all the politicians are, we don't have any George Washingtons running for the presidency. And even when George Washington was running, that Parson Weems story about George Washington were telling a lie, that was all made up as well. And if you're a politician, then you can expect as a going rate that some of what they're saying, if not most of what they're saying, is not true. And I read some comments that Martha Washer made about George Washington, and it's amazing to see what she was saying about it. They were saying that George Washington, Parson Weems created that myth, right? He doesn't. George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, and he could not tell a lie. And you ought to read what Martha Washington, his wife, said about George Washington. She said he was a politician, and of course he could lie, because that's what. When politicians I'm surprised when politicians tell the truth. And the further they get away from their constituents, the more you have to be asking about what it is they're saying, and then let's go and check it out and see if any of that has any bearings in terms of what we can find on the record that maybe contravenes and counteracts what they're talking about. Because politics is not an honest sport, and it is a blood sport. And these persons that are running for office are going to say anything that they need to say in order to get the votes of the voters. But I've learned a lot during this election season, and the most critical thing I've learned, quite frankly, is how the process is designed to flaunt and frustrate the democratic process. One of the things that jumped out at me in my own education, I think I'm pretty much aware of what happens in the political process. I pay a lot of attention to the things that are happening on the national level, more so than many things happen on the local level, because the national impacts everything on the local level, particularly after 1913, after you had the way in which we elect senators in this country, and that which made which is the 17th Amendment in 1913, which for all practical purposes gave us a non-federal system that was intended by the framers. It took the federal system intended by the founders and made it a non-federal system, so that the 17th Amendment, the effect we elect, the way we elect our senators, for all practical purposes, destroys the federal system. And it makes the states a client of the federal government with no power to actually influence and impact what the federal government does. And that's a very different system, by the way, than that which was intended by the framers, because they intended a federal system where there be some powers delegated to the federal government in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8, where there's an enumeration and a delegation of the powers that are actually accorded to the federal government, and that was to be assumed to be the case by the states. That would be the way we elect the senators. The states would elect the senators by the state legislatures and send their representatives to the Senate, and they will be the watchdogs to make sure that those lines drawn around the federal government, the borders they put in place around the federal government, those borders will be in fact maintained, because the senators or the state representatives would be there to act as watchdogs of the states to make sure the federal government took this much power and no more. Well, that was changed dramatically, 100% in 1913 with the election of the 17th Amendment. And now there are no restraints. the states can place upon the federal government. So I pay more attention to the federal level of what's happening, because I know that that is the structure now, the all-encompassing structure that impacts on all the states. And there's no states that really there's no state that's in a position really to counteract what the federal government does, because the federal system was in fact not only perversely changed in 1913, was destroyed in 1913. If you understand how the process was changed from that which was intended when the Constitution was ratified in 1788. So now that we have the structure we have right now, I do in fact look at the federal structure, because that's where the impact is. The states really don't have any power except within the states themselves, but they are really client states of the federal government. They've been captured as satellites of the federal government today. And I even contend that the placement of the 16th Amendment, which was the amendment that allowed the federal government to do something that was also prohibited from the original Constitution, which was the federal government to tax income in this country. It was never intended by the framers that the federal government would be able to reach into the states and tax the citizens of the states being a barrier between the federal government and the states, where there'll be no taxing power of the federal government as it relates to the citizens inside the states. They could not do it. Direct taxes were in fact not allowed in the Constitution until 1913, and that is another shaking of the federal. I consider it to be like a spider web, that, you know, if you touch a spider's web, the whole web shakes. So the 16th Amendment, the income tax, and then the 17th Amendment, which is the amendment that in fact changed how the way we in fact elect our senators, I consider those things to have fundamentally shaken the spider's web, in this case the spider web being the federal system, and it has become something very different than what was intended. We don't have a federal system anymore. We have a plutocratic system from the top, where the dictates are coming from the top, where the government is now defining what power it will in fact lay and accrue and define for itself, with no checks coming from any other place other than the federal government. In other words, the federal government today is going to define what authority it gives to itself, even if it gives to itself the power of Obamacare, which in fact ordained at the federal level. And then over here with the Roberts Court, they will in fact endorse their own power in terms of a power they found in the Constitution, where the government can in fact make you buy a product even against your will. They tried it under the Commerce Clause, right? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, and they tried it under that particular clause. And when they could not do it there, then they put in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which is the taxing provision, which John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, came over with the four tenors. You know, we got 3 tenors in music, 4 tenors on the Supreme Court, 4 liberals on the Supreme Court. And they were able to find where the Constitution allowed the federal government to make people buy a product that they don't want. And you put it under the taxing provision, and they can make you buy a product and engage in commerce even against your will. That's constitutional now. I mean, this is ludicrous. And it was never intended, but the 16th Amendment and then the 17th Amendment allowed some things to go on that were not ever in the purview of those who framed and founded the mandates in the Constitution, one after the other, nothing other than restrictions upon the federal government's power. And that's exactly what was intended. By adding to it, they didn't think they had enough restrictions in place by the original document, and they added 10 additional clauses to it, the 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights added to it, to further restrain the federal power. And that's what we mean by the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights given to the citizens of the United States. All that came crashing down in 1913. And I contend something that I don't think anybody else in the country is contending, maybe Napolitano to an extent in his book called The Constitution in Exile. And maybe the other book that is out, the one I brought here, I'm going to read something to it hopefully before we get off the air, the book called Organized Crime. And when I first saw the book, and before I actually read it, I thought they were talking about, when I first saw it, I saw the title, I thought they were talking about the mafia. And to an extent, they were talking about the mafia, but not the mafia in terms of these JVs. They were talking about the federal government, the Varsity team. And the subtitle of the book is The Unvarnished Truth About Government. So organized crime, the main title, the subtitle is The Unvarnished Truth About Government, talking about the federal government. And so the JVs, the mafia that's out there that don't understand that these guys are playing hardball. And no, this is not Chris Matthews, the one that's out here getting Donald Trump in trouble. The hardball, not the one on MSNBC. Hardball is in Washington, D.C. And that's where you really have organized crime. And that's the unvarnished truth about government that Thomas DeLorenzo is talking about in this book here, that I hope to be able to read some before we get off the air with those of you who are on Comcast. And if not, we'll bring that up to speed next time. But the government, the government, in my view, and this maybe Napolitano would agree with this, in terms of the 16th Amendment and the 17th Amendment, I consider those amendments to be unconstitutional, although the amendments are added to the Constitution. And you might ask the question, how is it that you could have amendments added to the Constitution to be in of themselves, although additions to the Constitution, to be unconstitutional in the document itself? And my explanation will be very simple, that you cannot amend a document to the extent that it cancels the document. In other words, can you amend a document so the document, for all practical purposes, cease to exist? I mean, what are those amendments? What is this? A written example of Samson, where you are over the pillars of a nation. In this case, in Samson's case, the Philistines, and by pushing the pillars down, you come crashing down with it and destroy your own self. And in other words, the amendments do what I know that they do, which is shake and shatter, quite frankly, in a very perverse way, the very intentionalities involved in the framing of the Constitution. If the amendments actually will rescind that and actually cancel that process out that was intended in 1788, when they ratified the Constitution, the founders, then with those additions that will in fact do that and rescind what was put in place, would they be constitutional given the effect? And I'm saying they are constitutional, they're unconstitutional in the effect of the documents. And I don't know if anybody go along with me on that. Some people cannot go along with Steve. Because I go quite a bit further than some of the ones out there who are these commentators who I think made them off base. I think quite frankly, you had something to say, John?
Oh, sorry. I was just checking the time, that's all.
Okay. I think that the commentators are even wrong in some of these so-called constitutional scholars. I think they're wrong in terms of validating the legitimacy of the campaign of Ted Cruz in a more general sense. I don't think he's eligible to run for president. In Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, it says that in order to be eligible to be president, there are three different parameters for the establishment of an eligibility for president of the United States. And they are, must have been in the United States for at least 14 years. You have to be 35 years of age. That's higher than the standard is for the other person running on the federal level. In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you have to be 25 years old. To be a senator, you have to be 30 years old. And that's because, as I said earlier, the senators were elected by the states. It was state representatives, so it's a little bit higher for the senators' qualifications for the age level than it is in the House, because the House would be the representatives intended for the people's body. But in terms of representing the states, which is the body that created the federal government, then the level, they went up 5 years for the level of the age requirement. So you have to be 30 years old to be a senator. And then they raised it even higher than that for the president, since the president is the only office holder that the entire nation votes on. We don't vote as a total collective body for the senators, because the senators are the ones running inside of each state. Each state having 2 senators, so 100 senators in the Senate. And then the state has districts in it, so they vote for the members of the House, and that's the people in those districts voting for their representative more directly, where the state has two. The districts have one, so each district is voting for a representative in the area of the state where those citizens live, and so they would be, that would be 25 years of age for that, but the state would be 30. And then for the president, they set the requirement in age-wise for at the age of 35. And the president, by the way, must be, according to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, must be a natural-born citizen. Now, everybody was very clear about what a natural-born citizen was when they're applying to Obama. And they were talking about, give me a birth certificate, and we got to see his birth certificate and all of that. Many persons thought the president was born in Kenya. And if that had been the case, and they were certainly raising that question in 2012, because after 4 years they were tired of this administration. And we get tired of all our presidents, by the way. The only president we've not been tired of is George Washington, the greatest president we've had, and the only great president we've had, by the way, in this country. The rest of those guys have been mediocre. And it's only what the court justice said about them being great. There's only one great president we've had in this country, and that is, in fact, the first president, who was great in so many different regards. And if he had not been great, we would not have inherited this country that we have inherited right now, given it was passed down by the legacy of George Washington, who set a lot of things in place that if he had gotten it wrong, then we probably would be Zimbabwe or Cuba by now. John just gave me the note that we're going to have to close down for the Comcast viewers.
Yeah, and you will continue, so just stay with us, and they can watch the whole program on All Points TV on YouTube, and also go to www.allpointstv.com, our website. So anyway, that's for just the Comcast viewers. So, okay.
Okay, and we'll pick it up for the other viewers on the other side of that, and we will in fact continue what we're doing. We're still doing an hour program. When we're doing the taping for Comcast, we'll do the first 27 minutes, then we'll break off and pause for a moment and get back to our discussion for the other viewers who are tuning in from the other sites. And we're very glad, by the way, to have Comcast with us, because that addition will help to get the studio out even more so in the community here in the Genesee area that we are in fact taping in. We're very glad to be able to do that. And we want to welcome those viewers aboard as well as we begin to broaden our broadcast into other arenas that go way outside of where we are here in the studio. I really think that there is an unconstitutional aspect to the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to do what was not intended by the framers, and that was to place a tax on the citizens directly by the federal government. That was never intended, and it's had all kinds of implications for where we're marching right now, the road to tyranny, if we don't understand how to circumvent this. This is where we're heading right now, because the power to tax, as they said in the court case in 1819, in the McCullough versus Maryland case, where they said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And that was the ruling that was made by John Marshall in his court, but it wasn't really made in our favor so much. It was made in terms of trying to maintain the power at the federal level, because what that case was about, as they are marching toward more and more state power, federal power, and that was one of the court cases that in fact solidified in one way the federal power, was the fact that when they set up the second Bank of the United States, BUS, the Bank of the United States, the first bank being set up in 1791, because Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of State, was a big government, person. And they're going to have a lot of fights over this taxation business, even in the first administration, with Alexander Hamilton sitting in there. And he's the Secretary of the Treasury, but he has an opposition inside that camp by the man who had written the Declaration of Independence, who believed in it, in the revolutionary aspects of it, and knew that they had fought a war over the taxation issue. The first War of Secession was the one that was fought in 1776 Took 7 years to, in fact, to end that war. In 1783, they signed a peace treaty, but this is a war over taxation. The first war of secession was over taxation. And Jefferson, who had been the main writer of that document, was sincere about what he had written down. And he understood that that was what this war was about. Alexander Hamilton had another understanding of it. And his understanding was very different from Thomas Jefferson. He was not prescient to the same view. And what Hamilton was trying to do, quite frankly, was to, in fact, restore a bank on this side of the Atlantic Ocean and repudiate the bank over there in England, the Rothschild Bank, but set one up here, because the objection in Alexander Hamilton's mind was the objection to being the payee. The payer. The payee was over in England, and his objection was to the aspect of the bank of the people over here paying into the bank over there. He had no problem with setting a bank up over here where the payers are now where he's now the payee. And that's what that was about. And Jefferson was saying no to it, and so was James Madison, who's called the father of the Constitution. And they're going to kind of come together and try to oppose Alexander Hamilton. And that bank will eventually go down. They had a 20-year charter, so in 1811 that bank goes down. But in 1812, you have what many people call the Second Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, where the British have come back. And that's where the country is going to have the national anthem that is later on become the national anthem, that's written in 1814. And while they're fighting this war in Baltimore, you're going to see the Capitol going up in flame, and their song is going to say, gave proof to the night that our flag was still there. And that's what that song is talking about. It's a poem later on put into a song, but they're talking about this war that had been fought from 1812 to 1814. And during that time, that war was costing money. And now the question is, how are you going to pay for it? And they decided they're going to set up a bank in order to do it. And so in 1819, they set up the Second National Bank. Because the First National Bank had gone in 1811, had a charter for 20 years, being set up in 1791. It had a 20-year charter. It had gone out. But now there's a need for the federal government that does not produce any wealth to then have an access to money. So they set the Second National Banks. And the state said no to it. The state said no. And in Maryland, when they tried to set that bank up, the state of Maryland, objecting to it, saying no to that bank setup, said that we are going to tax this bank. And the idea was to tax the bank out of existence. And there were two banks set up in the state of Maryland, and they taxed both of them. And when the state of Maryland went to the bank and began to ask for the $50,000 of taxes placed in that bank, which amounted to $100,000, and when they didn't get it, the tax collector who went there jumped over the counter and went into the vault and took the $100,000 out of the bank and had these bags and was walking out of the bank with it and so on and so forth, and turned it over. And that didn't sit well, and went to court, and that's what Marshall, John Marshall, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835, that's what he's talking about when he said that the Bank of the United States was in fact constitutional. Of course it's constitutional because the federal government did it. But it's not the point where the states have no voice. So they made so what happened there, and will happen over a repeated time period, what will happen there is that there'll be negotiation. And over time you'll see them making a negotiation and so on, and that will be reconciled. But in McCulloch versus Maryland, you see the court coming in and saying that They can't tax the national bank because the power to tax is a power to destroy. And when they did the income tax in 1913, the 16th Amendment, that what they did there with that tax, that and then later on the 17th Amendment, what those two amendments did, in my judgment, was to destroy together the federal system, because it was never intended that the federal government would in fact tax the private citizens. They were supposed to be, the insularity of the states was supposed to insulate the citizens and stand between them and the national government, so there's no ability of the national government to reach into the states and tax those persons there. There's a tremendous, I don't think person looked at this, but there's a tremendous shaking of the federal structure at that point. And I hear a lot of people talking about how we want to close the loopholes. That's amazing to me, because the discussion should be not to close the loopholes, but to teach more citizens how to, in fact, use the loopholes, because every one of the loopholes there is a blow for freedom in this country. I mean, close the loopholes as if the federal government is entitled to your money. And I marvel at these candidates and these politicians who make it appear that they're being benevolent by giving you back some of the money they should have had in their auspices in the first place. It wasn't intended by the framers. And they act like they're doing a favor by giving people their money back. And they determine, by the way, how much of the money they will get back. In fact, what they do is they determine how much of the money is given back, not based upon how much of the money that they've taken, but how much they have determined from their vantage point that they feel you need left over that you need to live on. That's really amazing that when you think about it, that the person that's doing the taxing, you see, the power to tax is what they said in 1819 in McCulloch versus Maryland. The power to tax is the power to destroy. And they're not going to apply that, by the way, to the 1913 amendment, the 16th Amendment, because they're not going to ever rescind that in terms of not having the taxing agent. But that's what it really takes in order to get the Constitution back down to the level where it's shrunk back down to underneath the Constitution. Until that happens, it's not going to happen. And people are whistling Dixie, even with the campaign of Donald Trump. They're whistling Dixie if they think that you're going to be able to corral and bring this federal government back under the auspices of the Constitution. How would that happen? And how would that take place? It's not going to take place. You can have goodwill to help begin to lower the intrusion, but that is one genie that's out of the bottle. And until we understand how the foundation has been shaken, we won't even understand what it takes in order to fix it. I'll tell you this, though. Here's something that I want to say about Wisconsin. Wisconsin can do a lot to throw a monkey wrench in the operation, which is about all you can do, quite frankly. You can frustrate some of the intentionalities that's now built into the network. And one of the things that they can do, and this is limited also, but one thing they can do is that they can, in fact, bring the merchants, the power merchants, out of the woodwork, even more so out into the forefront and out of the shadows so they can be seen, because they like to operate behind the scenes in the back, in the booth, in the dark, and then manipulate from unseen quarters. But they can be brought out of the unseen quarters, out into the public limelight, make them defend that which is in place by coming out in public to do so. And they can do that by what they'll do tomorrow in Wisconsin. And that would be going to the polls. Wisconsin has 42 delegates. And go to the polls and vote for the person who is in the lead in the Republican Party, who they don't want. They don't want Cruz either, but they don't want Cruz for a different reason. And they don't want him because he's an outsider. Cruz is not an outsider. Cruz is an insider. You can't be in the Senate and be an outsider being inside the governing body. So that's a myth there. But they don't like Cruz because Cruz points a finger at those who are inside like he is, and he'll point them out to take advantage of an outside status, pointing to them and using them to grow that idea he's outside of the network so that he can then do what he's doing, which is run for president after being in the Senate for 2 years. He's just mimicking what Obama did in 2008. But they can do something that throws a monkey wrench in his operation, and that is to go to the polls and vote for Donald Trump and flush these persons out. Because if Donald Trump wins in Wisconsin, he is now on course to get the 1,237 delegates to carry to the convention, which is not intended, because the process in which you can accumulate a majority plus one of the delegates that's out there is not intended for anybody to have. They intend to have a broken convention, and every one of those primaries is designed to lead toward that end, because they want to make sure they are in charge of making the selection, where the voters go to the poll later on and then make the election of those that have been selected. And that process is very convoluted, very complex, very complicated. But if you understand how to ferret out what's really going on, you can see that it's all convoluted to look like it's democratic when it's not democratic at all. It's an autocratic process made to look like it's democratic. It's not a democratic process. But there's a monkey wrench that could be thrown into it tomorrow if the people in Wisconsin can figure out their role in it and what they ought to be doing, rather than looking at siding with one candidate or another, but see themselves as part of a collective, that is, we the people being a collective against they the rulers, and you then make a judgment based upon coming behind the candidate that most frustrate their intent and get behind that candidate, and then go to the convention what they say are the number of votes is needed in order to become the nominee in that party. And they're now saying it's 1,237. But I will tell you this, what I like to see is someone go there with 1,237. And I'll tell you this right now, if they're not that person that they endorse, they're going to change those rules. Because I think it's anything above Rule 18 allows them, with the other rules put in place from 19 to 42, and there are 42 rules in the Republican Party playbook, everything that is above Rule 19 allows them to go into the Republican Party rules and change all the rules that occurred before that, even the rule of how many delegates that are in fact needed to get the nomination. And they can raise that. I mean, I would like to see what would happen if somebody went there with 1,237 delegates, because they can change that. That's not written in stone now. That is subject to an addendum, just like they had an addendum to the number of states that were needed in 2012, which they changed at the convention to stop Ron Paul. Because Ron Paul would have been a candidate whose name would have been thrown in the hat for the nomination, having won 5 states. That's what the rule was in 2012. And they changed that rule so as to be able to block Ron Paul, because Ron Paul was a populist just like Donald Trump is a populist right now. And Ron Paul, you throw his hat in the ring, and everybody's going there and they're frustrated with the way things are shaking out, because they have said that in 2008, we need to stop what Obama was doing. So in 2010, they gave the House to the members of the Republican Party, and nothing changed. And then, so in 2010, the House became Republican, and nothing changed. And now they are at the convention 2 years later in 2012, and people are going there frustrated. And they're looking for an outside even at that point. And Ron Paul, who had a record of being an outsider, who really has been standing resolutely against the kind of powers that are in Washington, because if there's one thing you can say about Ron Paul understands the intentions of the original Constitution before it was amended. I mean, he understands that. And he understood the limited government that was intended by the framers that would have these powers that are to accrue to the federal government, beyond which they were not supposed to reach into other corridors that were not intended. This idea of implied powers, which is a creation, by the way, of Alexander Hamilton, was never intended. The idea of implied powers in the Constitution is not was not intended. What was intended that the Constitution says what it says, and the delegated powers are explicitly stated, not implicitly stated, because what is an implication of it is up to the person doing the ruling. The Constitution is an explicit document, and those that took on the Alexander Hamilton view, who find something implicit in it, are saying that the document is a living document that can be interpreted to meet the needs of a given point in time. And that's what they're saying right now in terms of the document has certain implications in it. And these implications are discerned at different points in time, so that they're now discerning that you have to bake a cake. You have to bake a cake in the against your wishes. If a person has a certain orientation, you object to it, they're now discerned to find that you have no right to say you're not going to bake a cake. That's just discerned, last Tuesday in the Constitution. These kinds of ludicrous claims are made. I put that all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, because Alexander Hamilton was talking about amending the Constitution without adding anything to it. If you say that there are some implicit understandings in the Constitution that are not explicitly stated, you're saying you can amend the Constitution by claiming there's some implicit language that nobody has read before, but you're able to read it right now, such as Obamacare. That's where that came from. Or that's where you have the ruling in 1962 in England versus Vitale, where they found a separation intended between church and state, not able to be discerned until 1962, although it began to become shaken at the roots in 1947 in the Everson versus Board of Education case in 1947, where Hugo Black began to raise that, and then it becomes a major part of it. He's still in the court at that time in 62, where in England versus Vitale they did that. So that becomes another discernment based upon this idea that there are implied powers in the Constitution. And I put that all the way back to the time period in which Alexander Hamilton would have begun to put that idea out there. We didn't have an idea of implied powers, and there are no implied powers. There are explicit powers in the Constitution. This idea that there is I guess they would call it a strict constructionist and a loose interpretationist will come out of that concept. But a strict interpretation of the Constitution was intended by the framers, that it said exactly what it intended to say, and what it did not say, it did not say. That was their intent, that we are putting down as clearly as we can everything that's intended by the framers. And when they said in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, that you must be a natural born citizen, they weren't talking about a person's mother. Because natural born in that sense is how everybody, until we can find some other technologies, and they're certainly going to be looking for it now with all these different changes we're making in the way we do things sociologically in this country. And they might try to find a way to have some children brought here through another process, cloning. I wouldn't put that past people down the road. But I mean, we're already cloning sheep, and maybe they're cloning the beef. From what I went to a restaurant yesterday, I couldn't believe that was beef, but I don't know what they did with that. But working this new technology, who knows what will happen in the future. But what was happening back there in 1788, when they talk about natural born citizen, none of these technologies were in place or thought of, and so therefore that is very clear what was intended at that point. That is, you have to be born inside of the United States. Natural born, meaning born on the soil of the United States of America. Natural born to a mother, that's everybody's history, and nobody could even begin to think of anything different, not at that time period, although now you can think of some other ways they may in fact be brought about, because we don't know what the technology will hold tomorrow with all these changes going on at such a rapid pace. I mean, we are at, what's that book called Future Shock? We are into that right now, where the technologies are shocking us in terms of what they're coming up with, in terms of things that could not be imagined 2 centuries ago. But look where we are right now, 2 centuries later. But natural born citizen was very much understood in 2012 when we were raised in Obama's case, it was saying that you must be, is he a natural born citizen? They were trying to figure out, was he born in a hospital in Hawaii, which of course he was. But if he were not, they were raising the question then, is he eligible to run for president a second term? Because we are tired of our presidents. The only president we didn't get tired of is George Washington. And they wanted George Washington to run for a third term and really become a king. They were not tired of George Washington. They knew what they had. George Washington was one of the 5 great men in the world at that time, and they knew it. The world knew it. Because he was doing things that they had never seen before. I mean, this is the first time we had a person, we're talking about the first president of the United States, this is the first time we had a person in power that was not Attila. Every person that wielded power in the political arena before George Washington, and don't get mixed up with George Wallace of Alabama, this is the first person who held power going back into Samaria, ancient Egypt, you name it, in ancient times, there was not an Attila. And I'm using the word Attila based upon what Ayn Rand wrote about in her book called The New Intellectuals, where she talked about the 2 major players in societies. You had one that was a man of force, Attila, and a man of faith, which was the witch doctor. In all societies, from the beginning of established government up until the time of the advent of capitalism, were these 2 players. The man of force and the man of faith. Attila and the witch doctor, or the man of superstition. And that was it. Until the advent of capitalism in the 19th century, despite what Karl Marx wrote in that century, because he wrote the book called The Communist Manifesto in 1848, and doubled down on in 1869 and wrote the book called, the 2-volume work called Das Kapital, which I tried to get through when I was in grad school, but I had too many papers. I got through a lot of it, but not all of it. It's 2 volumes. But he wrote that book in 1869, and he doubled down on and expanded upon what he's talking about in 1848, 21 years earlier. And he wrote Das Kapital as an addition to that, an addendum to the nonsense he had in his earlier volume. Both of them talking about, really underneath the surface, talking about, socialism or fascism, or you could say communism. They all three are the same thing, just different components of the same thing. And I'm just making the point that through this whole electoral process, you have an autocratic system here. And the process is Attila, and you're going to always have Attila with you. Because Attila is going to find a way to come from underneath the restraints that are placed on Attila. Just a matter of time before there's a way they find out how to do it. And the way they found out to do it here is what Napolitano is talking about, that the Constitution placing it in exile so it no longer applies. And the Constitution is in exile according to his writing in his book called The Constitution in Exile. And also in terms of what Thomas Woods writes about in terms of the question he raised in his book, titled, Who Killed the Constitution? And I'll tell you who killed it. The politicians killed it. Attila killed it. In the capitalist formation, that's a 19th century creation. I mean, there were some people that were practicing it without having identified what it was. I mean, they were practicing it really after the first winter, with after the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620. They were practicing it after they found out that the tenets later on written about by Karl Marx wouldn't apply, because they tried those tenets back in that time period. Putting all the stuff in the storehouse. Everybody come and get what you need, and only to find out that there was nothing being placed in there. Everybody consuming it, nobody putting anything to replace it, and then the starvation occurred after that first winter. That's why you celebrate Thanksgiving, because they found out that didn't work, and they then put some of the tenets of capitalism in without knowing that's what it was, where each person would have their own private property, and they would begin to put in place their produce, which they create by their own efforts, and then they would have that which they're responsible for, so they would not starve, and you in fact benefit from that based on your own effort. And the other guy does the same thing. That's his property. He produces that. He does that for his own aggrandizement, and that's his effort. And when you begin to do that, you're creating the idea of capitalism without having quantified what it actually is. Although Although, let's say this also, although they've been written about by this tremendous thinker in 1776, Adam Smith, who wrote in The Wealth of Nations. Because he understood some things fundamental in this classic work that he wrote in that year, in The Wealth of Nations. And that's a book, quite frankly, that I read when I was in high school. I mean, when teachers up there talking up there, flipping these pages, I was reading in high school at that point. And when you make a person a reader, when you teach a person to read, the person becomes uncontrollable, quite frankly, through institutions, because once a person begins to read, you're reading things that are outside of the perverse view of those that's standing in front of you in these classrooms. And so they've learned that, so they don't teach people to read anymore. They're teaching them some other stuff I can't even mention on the air. How to put stuff on cucumbers and banana, all that stuff. Because you don't want readers, because readers are leaders, and the first person they lead themselves. So you cannot have leaders, because they're the leaders. And then to short circuit leaders come up on their own, you have to then short circuit readers, because readers will become leaders because they understand that there's something else that's not being told and begin to lead themselves with what they find out. Let me tell you this also as a side point, running on the QT and on the QT and running. There are no non-brainwashed people on the planet. Everybody on the planet is brainwashed. Everybody on the planet is living in a matrix. And that includes the people here in the United States as well. And our goal, quite frankly, is to get from underneath that which we've been taught and break away from it and begin to think outside of what they call the box. You know what the box is? The box is the entire universe that we're in. We're all in the box. We say thinking out the box. That means everybody got to think out the box, because the box is where each group in the boundaries that they live in have been placed in a box, because that's what the rulers do. And so we all trying to break out of the box. And I'm telling you, Wisconsin, there's something you can do if you understand the role you're playing. But that's hard to find based on we all trying to get out the box, and that is to get out of the thought box that we've been put into. And that's very difficult to do. Let me read something to you here about De Lorenzo on this point. He's got a chapter here, chapter 29. It's called Distorting History in Service of the State. Here's what he says about a court. He calls him a court historian. And he says a court historian is someone who produces statist propaganda disguised as scholarship. In other words, a court historian. Who are the court historians? Jonathan Gruber at MIT, who wrote the Obamacare, for example. These scholars out here writing these columns, those persons are court historians. A court, or those that's working at the university. A court historian is someone who produces statist propaganda disguised as, he puts this in quotation marks, disguised as scholarship. The purpose of the court historian is to provide cover, to pull the wool over the public's eyes, to make excuses for and glorify the state and the ruling class. A corollary purpose is to criticize or even demonize the civil society, especially the private enterprise system. So you see these attacks on capitalism, constant. In return, what do the court historians get out of it? In return, court historians are often given privileged positions in academia, government, research grants to finance their careers, newspaper columns, read those persons and see what they're talking about and why, and are turned into television and radio celebrities, quote unquote celebrities. They are the propaganda megaphones of the state. And so to break out of this is a hard road to hoe because it's very difficult to get out of it because it's all encompassing in every one of the countries because we're surrounded by the propagandistic methods that they use in order to bring about, greater control of the population in every one of the states. So we're all in a box. But Wisconsin is just like Jeffries back there in the time of Jack Johnson, right? Where they were saying, Jeffries is up to you. Well, Wisconsin is up to you. Because you can do something great tomorrow if you understand the role that you're playing in terms of the real issue in this election, and that is not just these individuals running, but something much bigger than that. If you understand that, we'll see the results of it tomorrow after the polls close, and we'll see how you do. Okay, got to get out of here. We want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.